Hi everyone, today is going to be a little bit different. Rather than our following along with the replay of a turn, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are in the campaign so far because it is January 1st, 1942. We've played through our first month of the campaign, and so it'll be a time to talk about what's happened so far, talk about what I think is going to happen in the future, and also it'll be a good jumping off point for folks that have not been following the after action reports that I've posted so far. I'm also going to talk just very briefly about War in the Pacific, the game, and the Focus Pacific mod. Most of you are probably familiar with War in the Pacific Admirals Edition if you're watching this video. It is a game that simulates the Pacific conflict in absolutely brain-breaking detail, with day-to-day turns, individual modeling of every aircraft and every ship in the conflict. And it originally came out more than 10 years ago. I think Admirals Edition came out in 2008 or so. The fact that people are still playing it and it's has a very active community goes to show how good of a game it is, because there's really nothing quite like it covering the Pacific theater of the war. So for those of you who have seen the game before, the reason that this is a little bit different is because it is a modded version of the game. The mod is called Focus Pacific, and it's a mod that asks the question, it's an alt history scenario, asks the question, hey, what would things be like if every country was more prepared for the upcoming conflict than it was historically? What if Japan was more industrialized? What if more countries tore up the Washington Naval Treaty earlier? What if some of the aircraft and ship designs that were only put down on paper, only experimental, what if they were developed into actual ships and actual concepts? What if the French Navy wasn't sunk at Mers el Kabir, and instead of being sunk was instead allowed to head to the Pacific? So asks a lot of these questions. It is not, like I said, it's not a historical mod. It is a mod that strains believability quite a bit, but that's kind of what makes it fun too. You get to play with a lot of toys that weren't available to the Allies or to Japan historically, so it creates a fresh experience. You're not going to rehash the historic events, and things can instead take a very, very different turn, all with the backdrop of course, the Pacific theater of World War II. And we saw in this game so far that deeply ahistorical bent when my opponent, Mavinos, the person I'm playing in this play-by-email campaign, he started off with, instead of striking Pearl Harbor, he went for Sydney. And the first day he came for Sydney and sunk nearly every ship at harbor, including a flight deck cruiser, the Melbourne, which is a very valuable ship to me. But it really threw me off balance early game because, of course, on December 7th, 1941, you expect a Pearl Harbor strike, and instead he came for Sydney, then he came for Brisbane. And not only did he sink a lot of ships at Sydney Harbor, the strike also very badly damaged the repair yards at Sydney. So I've had a lot of ships with a lot of damage still at Sydney. You can see some of the length of time it'll take some of these to get repaired, and I can't put them to dry dock because the repair shipyard has been damaged so badly. It's been repairing throughout the game, but immediately after the strike, it went from a 50,000 ton capacity down to a 1,000 ton capacity. Philippines is a theater that is going fairly well for him. I've retreated back to 3 bases here: Bataan, Clarkfield, and Manila. I'm now building up defenses there. I have pretty much the entire Philippine army in these 3 bases. I've been using PBY Catalina flying boats to pick up forces from the rest of the Philippines and fly them in here. I've also been flying in supply. So I have well-defended forces behind forts, but he's coming with a lot of units to take my bases. It looks like 10 units going for Clarkfield, 23 units here going for Clarkfield, some other units moving up, probably going to try to encircle Manila, maybe hit Clarkfield as well. So it's going to be some large battles, but I'm confident that I'm going to be able to hold out for a while because of my supply situation, because of the fact that I have well-rested troops here that are much stronger than they were historically, simply because I was able to keep them in supply, amass them, and I didn't fight him for territory in the Philippines. I knew that he'd be able to overwhelm me if I kept my troops isolated and fought for every hex, so I've really tried to bring them back into some more defensible areas, especially the urban terrain of Manila will really help my forces out. In Malaya, things are going slowly. He's chosen to march a lot of his troops down through the jungle here, which has really slowed him down, so I still own most of southern Malaya. Singapore still stands, and Singapore is very, very well defended, has about 1,400 assault strength right now. We're continuing to build forts, and I expect for Singapore to hold out for months or more. Is going to have a really hard time taking this hex unless he brings an overwhelming amount of troops here. The other thing that I've been able to do, because he's been kind of slow coming down Malaya and hasn't established any air bases close to Singapore, I've still been able to run ships into Singapore and run supply into Singapore. So right now it's sitting at 147,000 supply. I have regular supply convoys still coming into Singapore to allow it to hold out in the case of a siege. He's taken some bases in northern Borneo, Miri, Brunei, and this is to be expected. Miri usually falls on December 7th or December 8th usually. And I've evacuated most of these base forces that start in these areas by flying boat again. I use my patrol craft to pick up a lot of troops. It's one of the things I do quite a bit, to move them to places where they're going to be less vulnerable. So they're moved to western Borneo here, where they can build bases, they can build forts, they can build airfields, and be more of use rather than just getting steamrolled over here where I can't support them. No action yet in Burma. He's moved some troops here. They didn't used to be here. I imagine he's building an airbase in this hex, but so far has not taken these bases on the Malaya Peninsula and has not moved toward Burma. Rangoon, again, like Singapore, he hasn't really been trying to sink my shipping coming into Rangoon, so I've been able to run multiple supply convoys into Rangoon. I've been able to build up the base by bringing some infantry regiments there, some engineers, and so Rangoon right now has about 600 AV, I think. Yeah, about 600 assault strength. Troops are resting there, getting their morale up, decreasing their fatigue, and I'm building the airbase right now, but once I'm done, we'll get those forts up to 4 or 5 before he's able to make it there. Pegu is also fairly well defended. I think I have about, nearly 400 assault value there. And to take Pegu, he has to cross this river, and that's always a tough assault for them to make. Crossing a river into a enemy-held hex is always very painful for the attacker. Eventually also move some blocking forces up here, so he doesn't just go around Pegu and come down south. To help reinforce Burma, I also have reconstituted a Chinese corps, and it will head down the road to Leishao, where it will then be moved by rail to Pegu and help shore up the defenses there. The corps is pretty beat up right now. All Chinese corps start out the game in really poor shape, but by the time he gets there, they'll be in good supply next to Rangoon and be able to recover some of their disabled squads and replace some of their missing ones. Down here in southern China, a couple things have happened. Hong Kong fell, I think, in the first week. It didn't last long, just like it didn't last very long historically. And actually, it might have lasted a little longer historically than it did here. But he brought overwhelming force to Hong Kong, overwhelmed it easily. I also have this French base of Quangchawan, a French enclave in southern China, and we have some destroyers there, some very capable destroyers. The first turn I sent them out and sunk some shipping at Sama, but since then he brought overwhelming air raids to the hex, sunk my destroyers in port, which was sad to see. I really like those destroyers, and shut down the airfield with lots of fighter sweeps, lots of bombing of the airfield, and he brought in pretty sizable bombardment force with several battleships and a battlecruiser to bombard the airfield here. And after a while said, you know what, my destroyers are already sunk. I really don't need to keep my aircraft at this base anymore. It's not doing me a lot of good. I've moved out the troops. They'll head up to some bases in China, where then I may move them to India, where they're going to do more good. Otherwise, they're just going to sit here at Quangchawan, become isolated, and they'll be defeated in detail. I don't need that. Let's talk about China, since we're already here. China always starts as a mess for the Allies. You start off with units scattered around southern China in open terrain, and they're just begging to be, again, defeated in detail, picked off by the superior Japanese army. Your forces in China, individually too, are also in rough shape. They all suffer from high disablements, low morale, low experience, a lot of times high fatigue, which means that 1-for-1 up against Chinese forces, even if on paper they look like they're going to be able to stand up to the Japanese, they get steamrolled. To prevent that from happening, to me, what I've done is I've moved my Chinese forces back into more favorable terrain. So what I've done is try to make a defensive line that starts in the mountains to the north, continues to the mountains south of Sian, to this rough and wooded terrain north of Aichang, and then we'll make a line along this river with good cover, and the defensive line will end right around here. He can bypass me up through here, but he's going to be moving through a lot of jungle and rough terrain. It'll take him a long time to do so if he wants to come through here and then cut my connection with Burma. I do have supply pumping in from Burma to China. China is always very, very short of supply. I also have some transport planes running, I think they called it the hump historically, over the Himalayas. This is a little bit earlier than they just started doing it historically, I believe, but these transport planes are flying in supplies to Qingtu, where they can then be distributed through these roads to the rest of China. What else has happened so far in the game? He made an attempt at Wake Island, led an invasion force. It wasn't quite enough, and I think he got some bad dice rolls as well. But it almost became a Allied disaster when I brought the Allied carrier forces off of Wake Island to about here, I think, to use my aircraft to bomb his forces that were there on the island to help my defenders out. And about 3 turns before, I had lost sight of the KB, the Kidobutai, the Japanese fast carrier task force that struck historically at Pearl Harbor. As the Allies playing war in the Pacific, knowing where this Kidobutai is very, very important, because you really, early in the war, you have nothing that can stand up against it. If you try to put your carriers up against the Kidobutai in 1941 or even 1942, it's probably going to go very, very badly for you. The chances of having a historic Midway are very, very low unless you really prepare the battlefield. As they kind of did historically, to be honest, with having the ground support, the support of land-based aircraft, I should say, from Midway. In any case, my carriers were up there, and I had a feeling, having the lost sight of the KB about 3 days before, I just shouldn't stick around. So even though I wanted to continue to strike at Wake, I moved my carriers away about to here, and that same day, the Kidobutai shows up right around here. And if I hadn't moved my carriers away, there would have been a carrier battle, and I most assuredly would have lost. So I had to move my carriers at flank speed to the northeast, where I then had them rendezvous with some oilers, because that flank speed run used a lot of fuel, and then retired them back to Pearl. And luckily did not lose any of my carriers. However, that flank speed run did damage some engines on some of them, so my carrier force is now kind of laid up at Pearl Harbor for a few more days as they fix the engines and get them back in tip-top shape. Right now there's a campaign that he's waging to take Bismarck Archipelago, to take the bases north of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. I haven't contested this a lot. I have some French submarines, some American submarines in the area to try to sink some of this shipping, this invasion shipping, as it comes in. I also have some surface forces, some very light surface forces that are going to move up to try to harass his landing forces. I'm not bringing anything large here at the moment because, again, I don't know where the Kidobutai is. This is very close to Truk, a major naval base of Japan, and it's very easy for him, if he sees me moving any large forces into this area, to send some overwhelming force down here that I'm not going to be able to contest with. Instead, what I'm doing is really building up the Port Moresby area. This TF just dropped off a huge amount of supply. It's about halfway empty right now, but I think it brought 39,000 to the Hex. Originally, it's down to 18,000 now. It'll unload the rest of that and then head back to Melbourne. I'm also building up Tarapo, all the little Australian garrison fragments that are on the east side here. I've picked up with Catalina flying boats, picked up the Kaiving detachment with flying boats, and now I'm working on getting the rest of the forces that were forced out of Rabaul when he invaded by Catalina flying boats. Those will be brought to Port Moresby, where they'll help build the defense and make it a little bit harder for him to take. And again, I have enough supply here at Port Moresby now that I'm not worried about a siege. Unless he brings a couple divisions, he's going to have a hard time taking the Hex. What surprises me right now is the Dutch East Indies are nearly untouched. I'm used to, in play-by-email games, the Japanese player being very aggressive in this area and quickly moving to secure bases in the Dutch East Indies. That hasn't happened this game. And so I retained most of them. I really pulled out of this area fearing that would happen, so some of my base forces are outright gone, like turn 8. I've picked them up down to every last screw and brought them down to Darwin. But turned out I didn't need to, because he hasn't moved in force in this area yet. When he does, I have some surface task forces that I've disbanded at different dot hexes here. They'll kind of lay in wait in these small undeveloped ports, and when I do see the invasion task forces coming for my bases, I'll then reconstitute these task forces for them to run in and try to raid that shipping and those invasion task forces, and try to pick up some valuable transport kills. Always good to sink Japanese shipping. Another thing I should mention is the air game so far. So my opponent Mavinos has been very, very aggressive with fighter sweeps that have decimated my own fighters. He's played a pretty good game in the air when it comes to that and suppressing my air power. And as a result, I've moved all my aircraft out of the Philippines area. I've moved all of my aircraft out of Singapore. These are some fragments that are left. And like I said, I've moved all my aircraft out of Qingchaoan. There's just no reason for me to lose aircraft when having them at those bases doesn't do